You're not moving through a neutral world. Every conversation, every delay, every opportunity is meeting you halfway. What you notice, what you ignore, and how you interpret each moment is already shaping what comes next. Reality is not just happening to you. It is responding to how you observe it. Think about how often you move through your day on autopilot. You look, but you don't really see. You listen, but you're already interpreting. And yet, even simple observation is known to change outcomes. So what happens when most of your observation is unconscious? How many decisions are being made for you before you realize it? How many reactions feel inevitable only because you never paused to notice them forming? This isn't philosophy. It's about something measurable, the difference between reacting and observing, between repeating the past and opening space for something new. You believe you are seeing the world directly, as if reality arrives to you raw, unfiltered, exactly as it is. But that has never been true. Between what happens and what you experience, there is a silent layer working all the time. A layer you didn't choose consciously, but learned slowly. This layer decides what you notice, what you ignore, what feels threatening and what feels familiar. It decides what feels possible and what feels off-limits. This is the hidden filter between you and reality. From the moment you wake up, this filter is already active. You look at your phone, a face, a memory, a situation, and your mind instantly organizes it, not carefully, not neutrally. It sorts reality based on past experiences, emotional conditioning, beliefs you absorbed, and conclusions you forgot you ever made. You don't see what is, you see what fits the pattern your mind already knows how to handle. This is why two people can stand in the same room and feel like they're in completely different worlds. One feels calm, another feels tense. One feels opportunity, another feels danger. The room didn't change, the filter did. The mind learns this filter early, through repetition, through moments when you felt safe or unsafe, through what was praised, what was punished, what was ignored. Over time, your perception becomes efficient, too efficient. It stops asking questions and starts assuming. And assumptions feel like facts when you don't examine them. So when something happens today, it doesn't arrive alone. It arrives carrying echoes of the past. A tone of voice feels like criticism because it reminds you of an old wound. Silence feels like rejection because once, long ago, it was. A challenge feels overwhelming not because it is, but because your filter labels it as threat before you've even had time to think. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's a feature of the brain. Your nervous system is designed to conserve energy. It prefers shortcuts. It prefers prediction over exploration. And the filter is its favorite tool. It allows you to move fast, but at a cost. The cost is that you stop noticing when the filter is outdated. The most dangerous part is not that the filter exists, it's that it operates invisibly. You don't say, "I'm filtering this." You say, "This is just how it is." And once you believe that, perception hardens into reality. Not because reality truly is that way, but because you stop allowing any other interpretation to enter. This is how people get stuck in repeating patterns, same types of conflicts, same emotional reactions, same outcomes with different names. They think life keeps happening to them, when in fact the same filter keeps selecting the same meaning from new situations. Reality looks repetitive because perception hasn't changed. And here's the subtle part most people miss. The filter doesn't just interpret reality, it influences how you act inside it. What you expect shapes how you speak, how you move, what risks you take or avoid, and those behaviors quietly shape the responses you get from the world. The loop completes itself without you ever seeing the mechanism. You might say you want change, but your filter is designed for familiarity, not truth. It will favor what feels known over what is actually new, even if what's known is uncomfortable, even if it limits you. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. This is why simply thinking positive rarely works, because the filter isn't changed by slogans. It's changed by awareness, by seeing it in action. The moment you notice, "I am interpreting this, not just witnessing it," something loosens, not dramatically, quietly. But that quiet shift is powerful. You begin to sense the gap, the space between what happens and the story your mind tells about it. At first, that space feels uncomfortable. It removes certainty. It removes the automatic response. But inside that space, something important becomes possible. Choice. Without awareness, the filter decides for you. With awareness, you start to see the filter itself. And when you see it, you're no longer fully inside it. This doesn't mean the filter disappears. It means it stops being the only voice in the room. You start to notice when fear is speaking, when habit is speaking, when an old conclusion is pretending to be truth, and that noticing alone changes how reality unfolds next, because now the same event doesn't land the same way, the same moment doesn't trigger the same reaction. And that's where things begin to get interesting. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because two people can walk through the same moment and leave completely different from how they entered. And that difference has nothing to do with the moment itself. Two people can stand in the same moment and walk away with completely different realities living inside them. Not opinions, not interpretations they consciously chose, actual felt realities. One feels strengthened, clearer, more alive. The other feels smaller, heavier, shaken. And from the outside, nothing explains the difference. The words spoken were the same. The situation was the same. Time, place, facts, all identical. Yet something invisible shaped two very different inner outcomes. What separates them is not intelligence, education, or even emotional strength. It's what each person brings into the moment before it even begins. Every experience meets you halfway. One half is the event itself. The other half is the internal state that receives it, and that internal state is rarely neutral. Imagine hearing the same feedback from someone you respect. For one person, it lands as useful information. There's a brief sting, then curiosity. For another, it feels like an attack. The body tightens, the mind races. Defense takes over. The feedback didn't change. The nervous system did. This is because the mind does not wait for meaning. It assigns meaning instantly. It scans for familiarity, threat, approval, rejection. It does this faster than conscious thought. By the time you think about what happened, your body has already reacted. Heart rate shifts, muscles contract or release. Breath changes, and from there the emotional story begins to form. This is why moments don't shape people. People shape moments. The same pressure that turns one person into something sharper can crush another. Not because one is weaker, but because pressure interacts with internal structure. Like heat applied to different materials, one hardens, another melts. Most people believe they are responding to life as it happens. In reality, they are responding to what the moment reminds them of. A tone of voice might echo an old authority figure. A delay might trigger a memory of being ignored. A sudden change might activate a long-held fear of instability. The present moment becomes colored by the past without announcing itself. This is not about blame, it's about mechanics. The mind is a pattern recognition system. It's trying to protect you by predicting what comes next. But prediction is not perception. When prediction runs the show, two people can live in entirely different worlds while sharing the same experience. You've seen this in relationships. One person hears silence and feels peace. Another hears silence and feels abandonment. One sees uncertainty and feels possibility. Another sees uncertainty and feels danger. The difference isn't the silence or the uncertainty. It's what each person has learned to expect from life. And here's where the illusion deepens. Each person feels justified. Each reality feels true, because from the inside it is true. The emotions are real, the sensations are real, the conclusions feel obvious. And because the observer is unaware of their own lens, the experience feels objective. This is how misunderstanding grows, not from lack of communication, but from unseen perception. Two people argue about what happened, not realizing they are arguing from different inner worlds. Each convinced they're describing reality, when they're actually describing their relationship to it. But something subtle changes when awareness enters. When you begin to notice your reaction instead of being consumed by it. When you catch the moment your body tightens before the story hardens. That noticing doesn't erase emotion. It creates space around it. In that space, the moment slows down. You start to sense that your experience is being shaped from the inside out. And once you sense that, the moment loses some of its power to define you. You're no longer fully identified with the reaction. You're watching it arise. This is why the same moment can become a turning point for one person and a setback for another. The difference is not what happened, but whether awareness was present. Awareness doesn't make life easier, it makes it clearer. And clarity changes what the moment can do to you. Without awareness, experiences stack on top of each other, reinforcing old conclusions. With awareness, even difficult moments begin to loosen their grip. They stop solidifying into identity. They stop becoming proof of old beliefs. And when you see this clearly, another question starts to surface. If your experience of the same moment can change so dramatically based on how you perceive it, what happens when perception itself becomes habitual and unconscious? What patterns begin to repeat, not because life insists on them, but because the observer never changed? There is a quiet mistake most people keep making, and because it's quiet, it rarely gets questioned. It doesn't announce itself as an error. It feels normal, reasonable, even responsible. The mistake is believing that what keeps repeating in life is caused by circumstances, when in reality, it's sustained by the way those circumstances are observed. People say, "I keep ending up in the same situation," or "This always happens to me," as if life were looping on its own. But repetition is not random. Reality doesn't repeat itself out of laziness. It repeats because something in the observer stays the same. The mistake isn't the event. It's the meaning assigned to the event over and over again without being seen. When meaning becomes automatic, perception stops updating. And when perception doesn't update, behavior follows the same invisible script. Think about how quickly the mind concludes, "Here we go again." That sentence feels like wisdom, like experience talking, but most of the time it's not insight. It's prediction dressed up as truth. The moment you believe you already know how this ends, your body adjusts, your tone changes, your openness narrows. You start interacting with the present through the lens of the past, and life responds to that version of you. This is why people can change environments, jobs, relationships, even cities, and still encounter the same emotional outcomes. Different faces, different settings, same inner storyline. The external world shifts, but the observer remains familiar. So reality reorganizes itself around that familiarity. The mind calls this consistency. It feels safe. There's comfort in knowing what to expect, even when what you expect is disappointing. Uncertainty requires presence. Habit does not. So the mind prefers the known loop to the unknown possibility. The silent mistake is assuming that noticing repetition is the same as understanding it. Saying, "I know my patterns," without actually watching them in real time. True observation happens in the moment of reaction, not in reflection afterward. But most people only analyze their behavior once the emotional wave has passed. By then, the pattern has already reinforced itself. Another layer of this mistake is trying to fix the pattern from the outside, changing strategies, forcing optimism, controlling outcomes. But control operates at the level of behavior, not perception. And behavior is downstream from how you see. If you believe the world is unreliable, you'll act cautiously. If you believe people disappoint, you'll keep emotional distance. If you believe effort rarely pays off, your energy will be inconsistent. None of these beliefs announce themselves as beliefs. They feel like conclusions, and conclusions feel final. Over time, these conclusions harden into identity. I'm just someone who... And once identity is involved, reality becomes very loyal. It keeps providing evidence that confirms who you think you are, not because it's trying to trap you, but because you keep meeting it from the same internal position. The repetition continues until something interrupts the loop, and that interruption is rarely dramatic. It's subtle. It begins the moment you stop trying to change the outcome and start noticing how you're relating to it. For example, when frustration arises, do you immediately justify it? Or do you notice the sensation before the story? When disappointment appears, do you label it as proof? Or do you stay with the feeling long enough to see what assumption just activated? These moments are brief, easy to miss, but they are the only places where repetition loosens. The mistake persists because awareness feels passive. and people equate change with action. But awareness is not passive. It's disruptive. It interrupts automatic perception. It creates a pause where the old meaning doesn't fully land, and in that pause, something new has room to emerge. Without awareness, the same trigger produces the same reaction, which produces the same behavior, which invites the same response from the world. The loop feels external, but it's internal. Life isn't repeating itself. A viewpoint is. And when you begin to sense that, a deeper realization starts to form. If reality keeps mirroring familiar expectations, what happens when the brain itself is not responding to the world, but predicting it? What if repetition isn't just emotional, but neurological? What if what you call reality is, in many ways, a forecast you keep confirming without noticing? Most people imagine the brain as a camera, something that receives information, processes it, and then shows you what's out there. That image feels intuitive, but it's misleading. Your brain is not a passive receiver of reality. It is an active predictor. Long before you consciously register what's happening, your brain is already guessing what should be there. It does this to keep you alive. Prediction is faster than reaction. If the brain had to wait for raw data, interpret it from scratch, and then decide what to do, you'd move too slowly. So instead, it builds models of the world. It learns patterns, and then it projects those patterns forward, moment by moment, checking reality only to see if it matches the prediction. Most of what you experience as seeing is actually your brain filling in gaps. Sounds are completed, faces are assumed, intentions are inferred. You're not witnessing reality as much as you're experiencing a best guess, updated just enough to stay functional. This is why expectations are so powerful. When you expect something, your brain prepares your perception for it. If you expect tension, you'll notice every small cue that confirms it. If you expect rejection, neutral signals start to feel personal. The brain highlights what fits the prediction and filters out what doesn't. And because this happens below conscious awareness, the result feels objective. You don't think, I'm predicting this moment. You think, this is what's happening. This predictive process shapes not only what you see, but how you feel. Emotions often arrive before explanations. A sense of unease, comfort, irritation, or excitement can appear without a clear reason. That's the prediction running ahead of conscious thought. The body reacts first. The story comes later. And once the story arrives, it feels convincing. The mind is very good at explaining sensations after the fact. It builds narratives that justify what you're already feeling. This is why changing your mind through logic alone is so difficult. Logic enters the process too late. The brain also dislikes surprise. When something doesn't match its prediction, it experiences tension. That tension can lead to curiosity, but more often it leads to dismissal. The mind says, that's an exception, or that doesn't count, or I knew this would happen anyway. Anything to protect the model. This is how beliefs survive despite contradictory evidence. The brain edits reality to preserve coherence, and coherence feels like truth. Over time, these predictions become deeply ingrained. They shape how you walk into a room, how you listen to someone speak, how you interpret silence. You don't just predict events, you predict yourself, how you'll feel, how capable you are, how much effort is worth giving. And because behavior follows prediction, the world often responds in ways that confirm it, not because the prediction was accurate, but because you interacted with the world as if it were. The loop tightens. Prediction becomes experience. Experience reinforces prediction. This is why awareness is such a disruptive force. Awareness doesn't stop prediction, it makes it visible. When you begin to notice, my mind is already leaning in a certain direction, you introduce a gap. A small one, but enough to soften certainty. In that gap, perception becomes less rigid. You might notice details you usually miss. You might feel a reaction without immediately believing the story attached to it. The prediction loses some of its authority. It's still there, but it's no longer the only voice shaping your experience. This doesn't make life predictable or comfortable. It makes it real in a different way, less pre-written, more responsive. You begin to sense that what you call reality is partly a rehearsal of the past, playing forward through your nervous system. And once you sense that, a quiet shift begins. You stop assuming that what appears is the full picture. You become curious about what's being added, what's being omitted, what's being colored by expectation. That curiosity changes how the moment unfolds, because when prediction loosens, awareness gains space. And when awareness is present, something else becomes possible, not control but influence, not force but participation. The question then becomes, what happens in the exact moment you notice your own thinking? What changes when awareness itself enters the field, not as an idea, but as a living presence shaping what comes next? There is a very specific moment when something subtle but important happens. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or certainty. It happens quietly, often in the middle of an ordinary situation. A thought appears, an emotion rises, and instead of being pulled into it, you notice it, not to fix it, not to judge it, just to see it. That moment is where awareness stops being passive and starts becoming a creative force. Before that moment, life feels reactive. Thoughts lead, emotions follow, actions happen almost automatically. You feel like you are inside the current, adjusting as best you can. But when awareness enters, even briefly, the current changes. Not because the situation changed, but because you are no longer completely identified with the reaction. This is not about suppressing thoughts or calming emotions. It's about seeing them as events rather than commands. When you notice a thought forming, you realize it has a shape, a tone, a direction. It's doing something. And once you see that, it loses its ability to move you without consent. That is the creative point, the moment where the future is no longer a straight line from the past. Awareness creates space, and space allows options to appear. Before awareness, there is only momentum. The same trigger leads to the same reaction, which leads to the same outcome. After awareness, even if the reaction still arises, it doesn't fully define what comes next. Think of how often you speak on autopilot. The words come out before you even decide to speak. Awareness slows that process down, just enough. You might still feel the urge to defend, explain, withdraw, or push, but now there's a fraction of a second where you can sense the urge without obeying it. That fraction of a second is powerful. It's where creativity lives. Not artistic creativity, but existential creativity. The ability to respond differently, without forcing yourself to be different. Most people believe change requires effort, pushing, correcting, controlling. But effort operates inside the same mental patterns that created the problem. Awareness operates outside them. It doesn't fight the pattern, it illuminates it. And patterns behave differently when they're seen. This is why awareness feels uncomfortable at first. It removes the familiar storyline. You can't hide inside certainty. You can't rush toward a conclusion. You're left with the raw experience of the moment. Sensation, emotion, thought, all happening, none fully in charge. In that rawness, something unexpected happens. You begin to sense yourself as the context rather than the content. Thoughts come and go, feelings rise and fall, but something remains steady enough to observe them. That steadiness is not distant or cold. It's intimate. It's you before the reaction. And from that place, your actions start to change naturally. Not dramatically, subtly, a softer tone, a pause instead of a reaction, a question instead of an assumption. These small shifts might seem insignificant, but reality responds to them. People respond differently when you're not projecting expectation onto them. Situations unfold differently when you're not bracing for an outcome. Opportunities appear not because you attracted them, but because you were present enough to notice them. This is how awareness becomes creative. It doesn't manufacture outcomes. It opens the field of possibilities that was previously narrowed by habit. It allows reality to meet you somewhere new. Importantly, awareness does not guarantee comfort. Sometimes it reveals tension you've been avoiding. Sometimes it shows you how often you resist what is. But even that seeing is creative. It prevents unconscious repetition. It interrupts the automatic future. The more often awareness appears, the less rigid your experience becomes. Life feels less scripted, less predictable. Not because things are chaotic, but because you're no longer projecting the same expectations forward. And as this continues, a new temptation often arises. The desire to use awareness to control reality, to manage outcomes, to bend situations in your favor. It feels logical. If awareness changes things, then more control should create better results. But this is where many people subtly turn awareness into another form of effort, and that effort quietly weakens the very influence awareness created in the first place. At some point, once you notice that awareness changes how life responds, a natural impulse appears. You want to use it, you want to aim it, you want to control outcomes. It feels reasonable. If being conscious alters experience, then directing reality should make things better. But this is where something subtle turns against you. The moment awareness becomes control, it loses its strength. Control is born from fear, even when it disguises itself as strategy. It comes from the belief that if you don't manage every variable, something will go wrong. So the mind tightens, it plans, it monitors, it anticipates, and in doing so, it collapses the openness that awareness created. When you try to control reality, your attention shifts outward. You stop observing your inner state and start managing the world. You begin measuring success, tracking reactions, adjusting behavior to secure a desired result. This might look effective on the surface, but internally, something contracts. The body feels it first. Shoulders tense, breath shortens. The nervous system moves into vigilance. You're no longer present with what is. You're bracing for what might happen. And from that state, your actions carry a hidden message. I don't trust this moment. Reality responds to that message. People sense it. Situations reflect it. Conversations become strained. Outcomes feel forced. Even when things work, they feel fragile, like they require constant maintenance. Control demands energy and it never rests. The paradox is that control reduces influence. When you're trying to steer everything, you lose sensitivity. You stop noticing subtle cues. You miss timing. You override intuition. The very awareness that allowed you to respond intelligently becomes hijacked by agenda. This is especially visible in relationships. The more you try to manage how someone sees you, the less authentic the connection feels. The more you try to guide their reactions, the more resistance appears, not because they're difficult, but because control blocks reciprocity. The same is true internally. When you try to control your thoughts and emotions, they push back. You suppress one reaction and another appears. You label feelings as wrong and they intensify. Control creates internal friction. Awareness dissolves it. There's also a deeper illusion at play. Control assumes that reality is something outside of you that must be handled. But the moment you step into awareness, you already moved the point of influence inward. Trying to control from the outside pulls you back into the old model. Control is effortful. Awareness is receptive. One narrows the field, the other opens it. This doesn't mean you become passive or careless. It means your actions come from alignment rather than tension. When you're not trying to force a result, you're more attuned to what the moment actually needs. Sometimes that means speaking. Sometimes it means waiting. Sometimes it means doing nothing at all. Ironically, this is when things begin to move more smoothly. Not because you're manipulating outcomes, but because you're no longer interfering with them through fear-based effort. You respond instead of react. You participate instead of manage. Many people confuse surrender with weakness. But surrender, in this sense, is not giving up. It's releasing the belief that you must control reality to be safe. It's trusting awareness to guide action without micromanagement. When control drops, clarity increases. You notice when something isn't aligned without needing to fix it immediately. You sense when to engage and when to step back. Decisions become simpler, not because life is simpler, but because you're not fighting it. And here's the quiet shift that follows. When you stop trying to change the outside, your attention naturally returns inward. You start observing thoughts, emotions, and sensations without trying to alter them. And in that observation, something changes anyway. Nothing external needs to move for this to happen. No situation needs to resolve. No person needs to behave differently. The shift occurs in how you relate to what's already here, and that subtle adjustment, invisible to most, begins to change everything without appearing to change anything at all. There is a shift so quiet that most people overlook it completely. Nothing dramatic happens, no insight that feels explosive, no visible change in circumstances. And yet, from that point on, experience is no longer the same. Not because life has changed, but because the way you meet it has. This shift happens when you stop trying to alter what appears and begin noticing how it appears. The difference is subtle but decisive. Instead of pushing against thoughts, you observe their movement. Instead of resisting emotions, you feel their texture. Instead of reacting to situations, you sense your relationship to them. At first, this can feel like nothing is happening. The same thoughts arise, the same emotions show up, the same situations repeat. But something essential is missing. The struggle. The inner argument softens. You're no longer trying to win against your own experience. This is not indifference, it's intimacy. You are closer to what's happening, not farther away. When frustration appears, you notice where it lives in the body. When fear arises, you sense its speed, its pressure, its rhythm. You don't label it as good or bad. You let it exist without commentary. And because you're not feeding it with resistance or justification, it begins to move differently. Emotions complete their cycle. Thoughts lose urgency. Sensations shift on their own. Not because you made them, but because you stopped interfering. This is the shift that changes everything without changing anything. Externally, life looks the same. Internally, the center of gravity has moved. You're no longer living inside every thought. You're not swallowed by every emotion. You're present with them, but not confined by them. From this place, decisions feel different, not forced, not rushed. You sense when action is needed and when it's not. You don't have to convince yourself. The body gives clear signals, tension when something is off, ease when something aligns. This clarity doesn't come from analysis. It comes from contact. Direct contact with experience as it is, not as you think it should be. The mind relaxes when it realizes it doesn't have to control everything, and when the mind relaxes, perception sharpens. One of the most surprising effects of this shift is how others respond to you. Without trying to change how you're seen, interactions become smoother. People feel less pressure. Conversations flow more naturally. This isn't because you're doing something new. It's because you're no longer projecting tension into the space. Reality mirrors this openness. Opportunities appear not as miracles, but as things you would have missed before. You hear what's actually being said. You notice timing. You sense when to step forward and when to stay still. This shift also changes how you relate to discomfort. Instead of seeing it as a problem to solve, you treat it as information. Discomfort becomes a signal rather than an enemy. And when you stop fighting it, it stops dominating your attention. There's a quiet confidence that emerges here. Not the kind that needs validation, but the kind that comes from being grounded in experience. You trust yourself more, not because you have answers, but because you can stay present with uncertainty. This is why nothing external needs to change. When the relationship changes, the experience changes. The same situation that once felt heavy now feels workable. The same challenge that once felt overwhelming now feels precise. And as this way of meeting life stabilizes, another realization begins to surface. If this shift doesn't require changing thoughts or emotions, then who is actually observing them? If you are not the content of your experience but the space in which it appears, then the idea of the observer itself may not be what you thought it was. At some point, a quiet realization begins to form, and it can feel unsettling at first. You notice thoughts, you notice emotions, you notice reactions rising and falling, and then a simple question appears on its own. If these things are being noticed, what is doing the noticing? Most people assume the answer without examining it. They believe the observer is the mind, the voice in the head, the one commenting, judging, deciding. But when you slow down enough to look, something doesn't add up. The voice itself is being heard. The thoughts are being seen, so they can't be the observer. This is the plot twist most people never encounter. You are not your thoughts observing the world. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear while the world responds. At first, this can feel abstract, but the experience is very concrete. A thought arises. I'm not doing enough. You notice it. A feeling of tension follows. You notice that too. If you were the thought, you wouldn't be able to see it. If you were the emotion, you wouldn't be able to feel it come and go. Observation implies separation. This doesn't mean there's a separate entity watching from a distance. Awareness is not a thing you possess. It's the space in which experience happens. So close you've mistaken it for content your entire life. Because awareness doesn't speak, it's been overshadowed by the mind. Thoughts are loud, emotions are persuasive. Awareness is quiet. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it simply allows. When you first notice this, identity starts to loosen, not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle, disorienting way. You realize you've been living as a character in your thoughts, assuming that character was you. But now you can see the character from the outside. This changes everything about how experience lands. Praise and criticism don't stick the same way. Success and failure don't define you as completely. You still feel emotions, but they move through instead of settling in. And because you're no longer defending a fixed identity, your system relaxes. There's less internal resistance, less effort to maintain an image, less fear of being exposed or diminished. You become more flexible, more responsive. The mind doesn't like this at first. It tries to reassert itself. It says, this is confusing, or this isn't practical, or what does this even mean for my life? These thoughts too are noticed, and in being noticed, they lose their authority. Awareness doesn't replace the mind, it contextualizes it. Thoughts become tools instead of masters. Useful when needed, quiet when not. And because you're no longer fully identified with thinking, you stop treating every mental event as truth. This is where a new kind of freedom appears. Not freedom from thoughts, but freedom within them. You can think without being trapped, feel without being overwhelmed, act without being driven by unconscious narratives. And here's where the twist deepens. If you are awareness, then the observer is not fixed either. It's not located behind the eyes or inside the head. It's not personal in the way you assumed. It's a field of noticing that doesn't have edges. When you rest in this noticing, the sense of separation softens. You don't feel cut off from the world. You feel in contact with it. Sounds arrive without distance, sensations feel immediate. Experience becomes more vivid, not less. From here, another pattern becomes visible. When awareness is absent, the mind quietly builds limits. Beliefs about what's possible, stories about who you are, boundaries you never agreed to consciously. And these limits don't feel like limits. They feel like life. Once you glimpse awareness as what you are, those invisible boundaries start to stand out. Not to be destroyed, but to be seen. And seeing them changes how much power they actually have. When observation happens without awareness, it doesn't feel like observation at all. It feels like reality. Thoughts appear and are immediately believed. Reactions arise and are immediately justified. Conclusions form and settle quietly into the background. Over time, these unnoticed movements of the mind begin to shape invisible limits around what you believe is possible. These limits are not imposed by the world. They are created by repeated, unconscious observation. The way you habitually notice things becomes the way life seems to be. For example, a thought appears, "This is too late for me." If it goes unnoticed, it becomes a fact. The body responds with heaviness. Motivation drops. Options disappear from view. Not because they aren't there, but because the observer has already decided what can and cannot happen. Unconscious observation is efficient. It labels quickly. It simplifies experience. It reduces uncertainty. But in doing so, it trades openness for familiarity. The same interpretations get reused. The same emotional responses get reinforced. And gradually, the world feels smaller. What makes these limits invisible is that they don't announce themselves as beliefs. They feel like realism. I'm just being practical. I know how things work. This is just how people are. Each statement sounds grounded, reasonable, but underneath, they are perceptual boundaries formed by habit, not by truth. Because these limits live in perception, they shape behavior before conscious choice enters. You don't decide to avoid something. You simply don't feel drawn to it. You don't consciously give up. You just don't see the point. The observer quietly narrows the field, and life responds accordingly. This is how people live inside invisible boxes without ever feeling confined. The box feels like the world. And because the observer is unconscious, the box is never questioned. The body often reveals these limits before the mind does. A tightening when considering a new possibility, a wave of fatigue when imagining change, a subtle anxiety when stepping outside familiar roles. These sensations are not warnings. They are signals of perceptual boundaries being approached. When these sensations are misinterpreted as danger, the limit becomes reinforced. You retreat. The nervous system relaxes. The mind concludes it made the right choice. The boundary becomes more solid. Unconscious observation also affects how you relate to others. You begin to see people through fixed categories. This person is difficult. That one is unreliable. This situation never works out. Once labeled, perception stops updating. You stop noticing new information that doesn't fit the frame. And because awareness isn't present, these labels feel permanent. They don't feel like interpretations. They feel like insight. The most powerful aspect of unconscious observation is that it creates self-fulfilling limits. When you believe something is unlikely, you approach it differently. Your energy shifts, your timing changes, your attention narrows. And the outcome often confirms the belief, not because the belief was accurate, but because it shaped the interaction. Breaking these limits doesn't require fighting beliefs or forcing optimism. It requires making observation conscious, seeing the moment a conclusion forms, noticing the bodily response that follows, staying present long enough to recognize that what feels like reality is actually a pattern of perception. The moment you see a limit forming, it loses its invisibility. It doesn't disappear immediately, but it becomes negotiable. You no longer confuse the boundary with the world itself. This is where choice begins to re-enter. Not dramatic choice, but subtle choice. The choice to pause, to stay curious, to let experience unfold without immediately closing it down. As awareness grows, the observer becomes less rigid. Perception softens. The world begins to feel less predefined. Not because everything becomes possible, but because fewer things are ruled out automatically. And with that softening, a practical question emerges. If unconscious observation quietly shapes limits, what happens when observation becomes a daily, intentional practice? Not a belief, not an idea, but a way of meeting each moment before reacting to it. Awareness only becomes transformative when it leaves the level of belief and enters daily life. As long as it stays conceptual, it changes very little. You can understand it, agree with it, even talk about it, and still move through your day in the same automatic way. Real awareness is not something you adopt. It's something you practice in the moments where it matters most. Practice doesn't mean adding more effort. It means noticing what is already happening. Before you respond, before you explain yourself, before you decide what something means. These small pauses are where awareness lives. Most of life happens in transitions, between hearing and answering, between feeling and acting, between thinking and believing the thought. Awareness shows up in these spaces, not perfectly, not all the time, but enough to change the direction of the moment. This kind of awareness is physical. You feel it in the body before you name it in the mind. A tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, a rush of heat. These sensations are early signals that perception is about to narrow. Noticing them is not self-control. It's self-contact. When awareness becomes a daily practice, reactions slow down naturally. Not because you suppress them, but because you see them forming. And what you see clearly doesn't have the same power to pull you unconsciously. You begin to notice how often you rush to conclusions, how quickly you label moments as good or bad, how often you speak to fill space rather than to express something real. None of this requires correction. Seeing is enough. Over time, this seeing builds trust, not trust in outcomes, but trust in your ability to meet experience without losing yourself. You don't need to rehearse every possibility. You don't need to be prepared for everything. You can stay present and respond. This shifts how you make decisions. Instead of choosing from fear or habit, you sense what aligns. Alignment doesn't feel dramatic. It feels clear. There's less internal debate, less justification. The body feels settled, even if the choice is challenging. Awareness as practice also changes how you relate to others. You listen more fully, not because you're trying to be attentive, but because you're less occupied with your internal commentary. You notice when defensiveness arises, and you don't have to act on it. Conversations become less about control and more about contact. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. You speak when something is true, not when something is triggered. You set boundaries without needing to harden. You say no without guilt, and yes without overexertion. Importantly, daily awareness includes noticing when you're not aware, when you get lost in thought, when you react, when you forget to pause. This is not failure, it's part of the practice. Awareness includes noticing its own absence. There is no finish line here, no permanent state. Awareness comes and goes. The difference is that you stop demanding continuity. You work with what's available. And slowly, something measurable changes. Decisions feel cleaner. Regret decreases. Reactions soften. You recover faster when things go wrong. You don't cling to highs or resist lows as much. Life feels less like something to manage and more like something to participate in. This is why awareness cannot be a belief. Beliefs live in thought. Awareness lives in experience. It meets you where you are, not where you think you should be. And as this way of living settles in, a final realization begins to take shape. Reality doesn't change because you adopt a new philosophy. It changes because the observer wakes up inside the moment. And once that happens, the way the world responds is no longer the same. At some point, it becomes impossible to ignore what you've seen. Reality didn't change because you tried harder, believed more, or controlled less. It changed because the observer woke up inside the moment. The same situations may still appear, but they no longer land the same way. You meet them with more space, more clarity, and less automatic resistance. And from that shift alone, life responds differently. Nothing mystical happened. Nothing external was forced. You simply stopped confusing habit with truth. You stopped letting unconscious perception decide everything for you. And once you see that your experience is shaped from the inside out, you can't fully go back to sleep. So here's the question that stays with you after this. If your perception shapes your experience, what in your life right now is being created by awareness, and what is being created by unobserved habit? If you stayed with this until the end, write this sentence in the comments. I am noticing how I observe. And if this resonated with you and you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen now. It's there for a reason.